On the morning of the 23rd of July, 2024, at about 10 o'clock, a few dozen people were standing on a wooden boardwalk in Yellowstone National Park, taking photographs of a pool of clear blue water, and the ground under that pool opened up. What came out was not lava, it was not fire, it was boiling water and broken rock, and it went 400 to 600 feet into the air, which is taller than most buildings any of us have ever stood next to. The boardwalk was smashed. Gray mud came down on the parking area. People ran with their hats in their hands and their cameras still recording, and that is why we have the footage. It is the first explosion of its kind in Yellowstone that was ever caught clearly on video. Nobody died, nobody was even seriously hurt. And that is luck, not design. To give you the scale of it, honestly, Old Faithful, the most photographed column of water in the United States, throws to somewhere around 130 feet on a typical eruption. What came out of the ground at Biscuit Basin that morning was several times that. It was full of rock, and it arrived with no schedule, no sign, and no ranger standing there telling people when to expect it. Now here's the part that almost nobody said out loud afterward, and it is the whole reason for this video. That explosion had no magma in it, none. Not a drop of molten rock was involved. The United States Geological Survey said so plainly within days. It was not caused by volcanic activity. The place is called Biscuit Basin. It sits just over 2 miles from Old Faithful. And if you have ever been to Yellowstone, you have almost certainly driven past it. So, let me put the thing on the table right at the start, because this channel does not do fake countdowns. Yellowstone is not about to erupt. The supervolcano is not the story. The story is that Yellowstone has a completely different way of going off. It has used it twice in the last 2 years, and there are scientists sitting in front of screens right now trying to work out whether it gives any warning at all, because it happened again. And the second time, it happened about 300 feet from a brand new machine that was built to listen for exactly that. Let me take you through it, because the detail is better than any summary. After the 2024 explosion, the park closed Biscuit Basin. It did not reopen. It has been closed ever since, which tells you something about how the people who run that park read the situation. And Biscuit Basin, it turns out, has form. This was not a place that surprised anybody who had read the record. Geologists went back through the history of that one small basin and found that the ground around those pools has been throwing rock and mud for more than a century. There was what the observatory calls a dirty eruption at a neighboring feature named Wall Pool in 2009, photographed by a visitor, small enough that most people filed it under interesting rather than dangerous. There are accounts going back into the early decades of the park. What Biscuit Basin has been doing, quietly, in a corner of Yellowstone that most people walk through in 20 minutes on their way to somewhere more famous, is behaving exactly like what it is. An unstable piece of ground with a sealed pressure system underneath it, and a long documented habit of letting go. So, in the spring of 2025, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory did 2 things. They bolted a camera to a post and pointed it at that pool, and they put in a permanent monitoring station in the basin itself. Then, at 9 minutes and 50 seconds past 5, on the morning of Saturday the 13th of June, 2026, the instruments picked up something strange, a seismic signal, and underneath it a sound. A very low sound, far below what your ear can hear, the kind of rumble that a microphone built for the purpose can pick up from miles away. Scientists call it infrasound. It came from the direction of that same pool. Nobody saw it happen. It was before dawn, and the basin was closed anyway. But as the sun came up, park staff started noticing something wrong with the river. The Firehole River, which runs down past the geyser basins, had turned a pale, milky gray. Not in one spot. For nearly 4 miles, all the way down to Midway Geyser Basin. Something upstream was pushing sediment into it in enormous quantity. And from the road, you could see 2 brand new channels of water running out of Biscuit Basin toward the river. Channels that had not existed the day before. The geologists walked in the next day. What they found was 3 separate sets of new vents that had ripped open in the ground north of the pool. The largest was a crack about 61 feet long and up to 5 feet wide, full of water at 194 degrees. At that elevation, water boils at about 200 degrees. So, this was water sitting 6 degrees under boiling, in a crack that had not been there on Friday. Rocks were scattered all around it, thrown out when it opened, but only a few yards. This was a small event compared to 2024, which matters, and I will come back to why. And then they went back 2 days later. And this is the moment in this whole story that I cannot stop thinking about. On ground, the team had physically walked across on the Sunday. By Tuesday morning, there was a pool, a new one, roughly 21 feet by 17 feet, full of gray silty water, boiling hard. It had not blown open. There was no debris ring around it, which tells a geologist that it did not explode outward. The ground simply collapsed downward into something hot underneath. And it was making a noise, a thumping, as steam bubbles formed down in the dark and then collapsed, loud enough that it startled them. 5 days after that, the camera caught it throwing water 20 to 30 feet in the air, on and off, like a geyser deciding what it wanted to be when it grew up. There is no boardwalk there now. There is no railing. There is a hole in the ground that made itself over a weekend in a place where, 2 summers earlier, people had been standing with cameras. Stay with me. Because the question that follows from this is not the one most people ask about Yellowstone, and the answer is genuinely surprising. Here is the belief. I have heard it my whole life, and so have you. Yellowstone is a supervolcano. It is overdue. One day, maybe soon, it is going to erupt, and it will bury the middle of the United States in ash and end the country as a functioning place. There are documentaries built on that sentence. There are magazine covers. There are family arguments about whether to visit. And it is not that the supereruption is impossible. It is that the number attached to it is so small that it drops out of any honest conversation about risk. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory puts the annual probability of a supereruption at roughly 1 in 730,000. Let that sit for a second. Not 1 in 1,000, not 1 in 100,000, 1 in 730,000 in any given year. Meanwhile, the thing that actually blew up in front of tourists happens on a scale of decades. So, the question is not whether Yellowstone is dangerous. It is. The question is whether we have all been staring at the wrong danger for about 50 years. And I think the honest answer is yes. Now let me show you why water does this. Because once you see the mechanism, the 2024 explosion stops looking like a freak event and starts looking like something Yellowstone does on a schedule we simply have not been paying attention to. Under the park, there is a huge amount of hot rock, and above it there is groundwater. That water gets heated far past what you would think of as hot. In an open system, it rises, it finds a path, and it comes out as a hot spring or a geyser. That is the safe version. A geyser is a pressure release valve that works, but Yellowstone's water carries dissolved silica. And as that water cools and moves through cracks, the silica comes out of solution and coats the walls of the plumbing. Over years, over decades, it seals the cracks. The valve closes. Now you have water heated past boiling, sitting under pressure in a sealed container, exactly like a pressure cooker on a stove. It stays liquid only because the pressure is holding it there. It is not calm, it is loaded. And then something changes the pressure. Maybe an earthquake shakes the plumbing. Maybe a nearby vent drains. Maybe the seal simply gives out under the strain. Whatever it is, the pressure drops for a moment. And every bit of that superheated water flashes into steam at once. Water expanding into steam takes up roughly 1,600 times more room. That happens in a fraction of a second. Underground, inside solid rock. The rock loses. It shatters. It gets thrown, and a crater opens where the ground used to be. That is a hydrothermal explosion. No magma, no lava, no eruption in the sense that anyone means it. Just water that was held too tight for too long. And I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this that would be dishonest. The heat under all of it does come from the magma system. Yellowstone is a volcano, and that is why the water is hot in the first place. But in the explosion itself, nothing molten is involved. The magma is the stove. The water is what comes off the pan. Which raises the obvious question, how big can this get? And the answer to that is sitting in northern Wyoming right now, full of water, with tourists driving past it every summer. Go to the north edge of Yellowstone Lake. There is a bay there called Mary Bay. It is a beautiful curve of shoreline, and there is nothing about it that looks like a wound. It is a crater. It is about 1.5 miles across, and it is the largest hydrothermal explosion crater ever documented anywhere in the world. It formed roughly 13,800 years ago, and possibly not in one go. Possibly in several explosions close together. Estimates put the plume from it at something on the order of 1 mile high, though that figure comes from reconstruction rather than measurement, so treat it as an order of magnitude rather than a reading. What set it off is the part that stays with you. The lake level dropped suddenly by something like 45 feet, most likely because a large earthquake on the lake floor triggered a wave that tore out the lake's outlet. Take 45 feet of water off the top of a hydrothermal system, and you have just removed an enormous amount of pressure from every superheated pocket underneath it. All of them flashed. And Mary Bay is not alone. Indian Pond, Turbid Lake, Duck Pond, Pocket Basin, Elliott's Crater, which is under the lake. Drive the loop road around Yellowstone Lake, and you are driving past a string of explosion craters that people photograph because they think they are ponds. Almost all of the big ones formed within a few thousand years of the end of the last ice age, about 14,000 years ago. That is not a coincidence. 1 mile of ice coming off the landscape is the biggest pressure change that system has ever experienced. Anything older than that was scraped away by the ice itself, so the record only starts there. Now come forward to something inside living memory for a lot of people watching this. Norris Geyser Basin, the 5th of September, 1989, 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon. There was a small feature there called Porkchop Geyser. It had been behaving oddly for a while, spraying constantly instead of erupting in bursts. 8 visitors were standing there watching it. The spray started climbing, 65 feet, 100 feet. And then Porkchop Geyser blew itself apart and threw rocks more than 200 feet. 8 people, standing in the open, watching. Not one of them was hit. What caused it was the same thing as Biscuit Basin, in miniature. The vent had narrowed. Mineral deposits had throttled it. The pressure had nowhere to go. If you want to know the honest odds on all of this, they are next. And they are the reason I am not telling you to cancel a trip. So, numbers, properly, from the people who do the work. Small explosions, the kind that open a crater a few feet across, probably happen somewhere in Yellowstone every year, or a few times a year. Most of them are never seen by anyone. Something on the scale of Porkchop in 1989 happens every several years. Something on the scale of the 23rd of July, 2024. A genuine explosion that would kill you if you were standing on it happens somewhere between once a decade and once every few decades, on average, across the entire park. Something that opens a crater about the size of a football field happens perhaps once every several hundred years. And a Mary Bay, the true monsters, once every several thousand years. Notice what that means for a visitor. The park covers over 2 million acres. Explosions happen at night, in winter, in backcountry basins where nobody goes. The probability of any specific person being hurt is far lower than the probability of an event. And the historical record of visitor deaths from hydrothermal explosions in Yellowstone is essentially empty. What kills people in Yellowstone thermal areas is stepping off the boardwalk into hot water. That is the real risk, and it is entirely under your control. There is one more caution in the data, though, and it is the sharpest thing in it. The biggest explosions are not random. They cluster after external triggers, big earthquakes, landslides, sudden changes in water level. Yellowstone has between 1,500 and 2,500 earthquakes a year. In 2017, it had 3,427. In 2011, it had 708. Almost all of them are magnitude 2 or smaller, and nobody feels them. But the system is capable of larger ones, and a large one is exactly the kind of pressure shock that has set off the big hydrothermal events in the past. As for the magma, since somebody always asks, a study published in April of 2025 mapped a sharp cap on the magma system at about 2.5 miles down and found that the upper reservoir is roughly 9% molten. The lower one is about 2%. To erupt, you generally need a great deal more melt than that, concentrated and gassy and ready to move. It is not. The last caldera-forming eruption was 631,000 years ago. The last lava flow of any kind was about 70,000 years ago. And if Yellowstone does erupt again, the most likely form by far is a lava flow, which is slow, local, and would not end anybody's country. The volcano alert level has sat at normal. So, 3 futures. The first, and by far the most likely, is that nothing you would call an event happens in your lifetime. Small explosions in the backcountry, vents opening and closing. Biscuit Basin stays fenced off. The new pool either grows into a geyser or seals itself over. And the park goes on the way it has for 150 years. The second, the realistic middle, is another Biscuit Basin. A genuine explosion, a few hundred feet of water and rock, boardwalk destroyed. And this time, it is not a Tuesday morning in a closed basin. It is August, in the afternoon, in a basin full of people. That is not a prediction. It is a once-in-a-decade to a few decades event happening in a park that receives millions of visitors a year. Sooner or later, the timing works out badly, and the Park Service knows it, which is exactly why Biscuit Basin is still closed 2 years on. The third is a large one, acre scale or bigger, triggered by a strong earthquake shaking the plumbing. Nothing about the geology forbids it. It is genuinely rare on human timescales. Several hundred to several thousand years between events of that size. And it would still be a local catastrophe rather than a national one. It would not be the Supervolcano. It would be a crater where a bay is now. Here is my honest opinion, after everything the research shows. We have spent decades being frightened by the one Yellowstone scenario that is essentially never going to happen to us, and almost no time at all on the one that already has, twice, since 2024. That is a failure of attention, and I think the Supervolcano story is responsible for it. It is too big to act on. 1 in 730,000 is not a risk, it is a story. Whereas water flashing to steam under a boardwalk is a real hazard with a real number attached to it, and it is one we can actually do something about. Close the basin, put in the instruments, watch for warning signs. And that last part is the genuinely hopeful thing here, and it is worth understanding what has quietly been built. There is now a network in that park listening for low-frequency sound, established over the last couple of years, and it hears things no seismometer would ever register. A geyser starting, a rockfall on a slope, a vent tearing open before dawn. There has been a dedicated monitoring site at Norris Geyser Basin since the autumn of 2023, put in for exactly this purpose, and it recorded a small explosion at a place called Porcelain Terrace the following spring. Piece by piece, the observatory has been assembling an instrument that can hear the park breathe, which is why the June explosion matters so much scientifically. It went off 328 feet from a monitoring station. No hydrothermal explosion in recorded history has ever happened that close to instruments. Right now, people are going through that data second by second, looking for whatever the ground did in the minutes before it opened. If there is a warning signal in there, it will be the first time anyone has ever seen one. Now, I want to hear from you, and I want a specific memory rather than an opinion. Have you stood on a boardwalk at Yellowstone? Most of us have, at some point. A family trip, a honeymoon, a long drive with kids in the back. And here is the honest question. While you were standing there, looking at all that steam, were you thinking about the supervolcano? Be truthful. I think a lot of us were, and I think a lot of us were quietly a little frightened, and nobody said it out loud. Tell me where you were standing and what was going through your head. I read these. If this was worth your time, like genuinely does move it in front of other people, and it cost you nothing. And before you go, the next one is about a state where the shaking was not natural at all, a place that had roughly 2 noticeable earthquakes a year, and then had more than 900 in a single year, and the cause was not a fault waking up, it was us. And then something happened that has almost never happened anywhere in the history of earthquakes. Human beings turned the swarm back off again. Subscribe so you see it. The ground beneath America is speaking. Make sure you are listening.